Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning if you're on the West Coast. I'd like to welcome all attendees, including our two presenters today for this education-focused information session on Churchill Fellowships. We've got Katrina Marsden from the ACT and Julie Dunbaben from Tasmania, both Churchill Fellows, and they'll be speaking about their fellowship experience and offering their insights through this presentation. So my name's Adam Davey. I'm the CEO of the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust. We're based in Canberra, and that's where I'm zooming from, Ngunnawal country. I'm going to begin this information session with an overview of what Churchill Fellowships are about, how you apply, and the sorts of things we're looking for. Before we do that, I'd like to acknowledge Australia's First Nations people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to recognise any Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people tuning in today and let you know that we have quite a strong cohort of Indigenous Churchill Fellows in a network that has formed with thanks particularly to one of our patrons, Tom Kalmer. So if you do want some extra contacts or support or advice in relation to Churchill Fellowships, you can approach the Trust to get in touch with that network. A little bit of housekeeping. You'll be able to submit questions via the Q&A function throughout the presentations. If you miss a chance or you think of questions after the session's finished, you can contact us directly via our website, email or phone details are there, or via social media. And we'll also be holding some more Facebook live sessions and more Zoom sessions over the coming weeks. So keep your eyes out for those. You're welcome to attend another information session. I also wanted to acknowledge the difficult times we're living through, particularly with the COVID pandemic over the last couple of years. It's been very disruptive. There's been uncertainty, there still is, lots of suffering and sadly death related to the pandemic. And I hope you're attending this session with a positive mindset and a hopeful outlook, as we certainly are. So I'm quite often asked about where the money comes from or the funding for Churchill Fellowships, and that's a good question. So a little bit of history, and I recommend you go to our website where we tell the complete story. But in a nutshell, when Sir Winston Churchill resigned as British Prime Minister in 1955, at the age of 80, he'd served under 5 reigning monarchs. He'd survived 3 wars. He'd been a writer, an historian, a journalist, an adventurer, a painter, the list goes on. He even won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953. So as you can imagine, there was a widespread desire to honour Sir Winston Churchill and capture the essence of his public service, his inspiration, his intellect, and even his humour. Now, he wasn't perfect, and you can read some insightful essays on our website that we've commissioned over the last year or so that explore Churchill through a contemporary lens. But he was certainly a man who readily believed that anything was possible if you put your mind to it. And he believed that the greatest figures in history were those who made a contribution to public service and to their fellow countrymen. I do wonder what he'd think of what's going on in the world today. When Prime Minister Menzies announced the sad news of Sir Winston's death to Australians in 1965, he also announced a public fundraising appeal. And on what we call Churchill Memorial Sunday, 28th of February 1965, there was a door-to-door appeal with over 220,000 Australians participating in collecting funds with support from the RSL. And around £2.2 million, that's about $4 million, was raised. And that includes government and business contributions, as well as the generosity of the Australian community. So it does remain one of the largest public fundraising efforts in Australia's history. And effectively, we use the earnings from the investments, that money is being carefully managed so that this wonderful initiative, Churchill Fellowships, goes on in perpetuity. Another question I'm quite often asked is, who are you looking for? What are the attributes of a Churchill Fellowship? And you can read what's on the slide there. I guess effectively Churchill Fellows are the types of people who are passionate and committed to furthering a particular issue. They want to learn and share their knowledge so that others in their communities might benefit. So the people that want to give back, that want to learn more. You'll see if you can see on my background here on Zoom, we've just launched an impact funding initiative, which effectively is us continuing to help Churchill Fellows impact when they return from their fellowships to implement their recommendations and their learnings. And I think impact is probably a key word there to think about if you're applying for a Churchill Fellowship. What will that short and long-term impact be of your Churchill Fellowship? So Churchill Fellowship is, I think, quite unique. It's a prestigious opportunity open to Australians from all walks of life. Now, importantly, it's not an academic scholarship. You don't need to have any particular academic qualifications. In fact, we don't care if you haven't finished year 10. That's not what Churchill Fellowships are focused on. And it's also not a funding grant. So it doesn't come with all the strings and paperwork and reporting and administrivia of many funding grants. It's quite liberating and freeing and trusting in terms of we send you overseas to do the project that you've designed, and we trust you to go and do that with our support, but not with our micromanagement. The fellowship is not just an overseas trip. It is actually the start of a lifelong journey and a contribution that you make to make Australia better. A Churchill Fellowship does not need to comprise formal research. You can learn new skills, you can build networks and observe best practice in your chosen field. So it's not about attending conferences. We do allow fellowship recipients, if there is a conference somewhere in the world that coincides with their planned itinerary of meeting people and learning things and observation, that can happen. But my advice here is don't design a Churchill Fellowship around attending a conference, because that's certainly not what a Churchill Fellowship is about. The fellowship is for overseas travel and must be between 4 to 8 weeks taken in one continuous journey. We've awarded close to 4,500 Churchill Fellowships since inception of the Trust in 1965. And each year we typically award over 100, and we're aiming to do that again this year. Churchill Fellows travel across the globe on the widest range and depth of topics and bring back to this country information, networks, projects, products, ideas, innovation, all things that help make our country stronger. So in terms of personal eligibility, you must be an Australian citizen, or as of this year, you can be a permanent resident and be eligible to apply. You have to be over the years of 18 by the application closing date, which is 28th of April. The ability to travel overseas is essential, and we can provide support for you if you have a disability. One question we have been getting is, do I need to be vaccinated against COVID to apply for a fellowship? And the answer is no, not to apply for a fellowship. But if that's a requirement for international travel, you do need to be prepared to do what you need to do to comply with what you need to comply with to travel overseas. So do keep that in mind. We now offer virtual research options for people who cannot travel overseas due to a disability or caring responsibilities. So that's our intent there, is to open up the opportunity to people who might otherwise not get the opportunity to do a Churchill Fellowship because they can't travel overseas. And also for people living in remote parts of Australia, we are going to be allowing domestic travel. So if that's you, please get in touch with us to discuss your options there. A Churchill Fellowship is an individual project. It's not a team project. So we often get the question, I work in a team and we're doing this thing, can we apply jointly? And the answer is unfortunately no. This is for an individual, but there'll be nothing stopping an individual who works in a team applying for and undertaking a Churchill Fellowship. We have had some cases where an employer will send an additional person along with the Churchill Fellow to participate. It doesn't make them a Churchill Fellow, but it does make them a part of the project. And one example that comes to mind is a Victorian organisation sent an Indigenous employee with their employee who was a Churchill Fellow, and they added a lot of value to that particular project. If you're undertaking tertiary studies, that's okay, but it can't form part of your tertiary studies. So we do get quite a lot of questions about that. And I guess what we mean by that is the Churchill Fellowship is a significant piece of work that we expect you to focus on and continue to focus on when you return. It's not intended to be just an adjunct or a supplement to your existing studies. So there's a lot of expectations that come with the Churchill Fellowship, and we want you to focus on that 100%. Now, I want you to hear that Churchill Fellowships are an opportunity for people from all walks of life. That's our mantra. It's something that does get thrown around a bit, but for us, we're really looking for a diverse range of people from all walks of life to apply. In terms of a project, it has to be obviously suitable for a Churchill Fellowship. And one important aspect of that is that it will benefit the Australian community in some way. So that's by you bringing back and sharing knowledge or ideas or practices or skills. You have to demonstrate that you've fully explored your topic in Australia to be considered. The reason for that is we don't want to send you overseas when you could have travelled interstate to meet someone already doing the things that you are telling us you need to learn from overseas. So do keep that in mind. The project has to be a self-contained project. So as I mentioned, it can't be part of a university degree that you're undertaking. It also can't be partly funded by another organisation. So we don't want a Churchill Fellowship to be co-opted by another organisation as the sort of external travel fund, if you will, for that project. It needs to be solely a Churchill Fellowship. Your project does not need to relate to your employment, but obviously, for obvious reasons, it often does relate to people's employment. And on that note, I would suggest if you're thinking of applying and you're not sure if you'll be given leave or if you can access certain types of leave, even if your employer will be supportive, I'd suggest have a chat to your employer and sound them out even before you apply, so you have a sense of, if you're successful, are you going to have any roadblocks undertaking a fellowship. We don't set limits on the topics or issues, so your project can literally be on anything. That's up to you to convince us why you need to do a fellowship on that topic. So, as I said, unlike many grant programs, this is something that you really set the topic and you lead the way on. So you design your own project, and if you can think of a suitable topic, there are no limits. We do offer some sponsored fellowships where generous individuals or organisations have agreed to fund a fellowship on a particular topic that they'd like to see explored. This doesn't mean that they're always awarded. Some of them are quite specific in terms of what they're looking for, but it does mean we're looking for applications in those areas. So you can have a look on our website, and indeed in the application form, there's a drop-down list of all the different sponsored fellowships. If you do apply for one, keep in mind you're applying for a Churchill Fellowship first and foremost. If you select a sponsored fellowship to be considered for, that has no bearing on your consideration for a Churchill Fellowship. It just helps us think about whether we'd allocate that sponsored one to you. So don't overthink it, I think I'm trying to say there. When framing a project, you must ask yourself, how will it be of benefit to some aspect of Australian society? So just keep that in mind. That's what we're going to be looking for. So as you'd expect, you apply online now using an online form that you can log into and log out of as often as you want to up until the closing date. If you have a problem using the form, if it's a barrier for you because of disability or another reason, please get in touch with us. What we don't want is someone to be turned away because they couldn't fill out a form. We'll find a solution for you. Remember, you're competing against all the other applicants. So we typically get around 1,100 or so applications, and we award around 100 fellowships. So it's quite competitive. So think about how you're going to convince the selectors to invest in you and your project idea. So to that end, you'll need two references, someone that can effectively vouch for your personal characteristics and someone who can be an authority in your topic or field. And a top tip here is engage them early as possible so that they can get their reference in, which is all done electronically through the form by the application deadline, because we can't extend applications. And one of the biggest dramas that people find at the end of the application process is that their references have gone on holidays and they can't contact them and they don't have the references. So identify them early, make sure they'll be around to do your reference. Churchill Fellows tell us time again that the process of filling out the application form really helps them distill their ideas and understand and focus in on what they want to do. So again, start an application early. You've got plenty of time left, but start now. Start looking through the form and forming your project idea in a way that will make a good application. Don't leave it to the last minute, because it won't be your best application. So in terms of your itinerary, we really want you to limit your destinations to those that will most benefit your project. Avoid high-risk countries. We won't let you go anyway. So if a smart traveller says don't travel, we won't be allowed to send you to those countries. Keep in mind, you won't be travelling till 1 February at the earliest if you're successful this year, 2023. So plenty of time for things to get hopefully back a bit more normal with travel. It's important to put forward the most complete itinerary that you can. And really what we're looking for in the application form, and you'll see it when you read it, is I want to go to this country, to this city, to meet this person or this organisation for half a week, 2 weeks, whatever that might be. And you know, I want to interview them, or I want to observe their best practices. That's the kind of level of detail. You don't need to go into a lot of detail about what you'll be doing there, but just give us a sense that where you want to go, how long you want to go, who you want to meet with, and what you're going to do when you're there. Remember, it is 4 to 8 weeks. That's the requirement. We use the information in your proposed itinerary to calculate the funding that will give you to cover your living allowances and accommodation and things like that when you're overseas, which is part of the reason we need that detail. If you make it to an interview, you will be asked to explain your itinerary and tell us more about why you've chosen those destinations and those organisations and people. So when we talk about COVID, you know, international travel has opened up again. We had a Churchill Fellow recipient leave for America last week, and that's the first time in a couple of years. That's pretty fantastic, and we've got a line of people getting ready to travel again. So I think you know, things are looking pretty positive on that front. I've spoken about the need to meet government requirements for travel, so we are going to ask you if you're willing to meet those needs. On the selection process, we've got selection panels and committees in each state and territory. We draw selectors from across a range of different fields and interests. Usually the process is the applications get shortlisted, taking into account referee comments. Interviews are then held to help determine who's going to be recommended for a Churchill Fellowship. We generally prefer in-person interviews, but can accommodate video interviews by exception, and there'll be a range of reasons for that, particularly with COVID. We had to do all of our interviews in 2020 via video, but they went very well. If you look on our website, you'll see a calendar or a timeline of the selection process with all the dates in there. Roughly half of those people interviewed will receive a fellowship. So if you do get an interview this year, that's in itself a very good achievement. So the odds are pretty good, but it is a significant competitive process. All the recommendations will be reviewed by our board in September, and then the final decisions will be announced. So I often ask for tips on the application process. The best tips I can give you are read and address the selection criteria in the form, and use as little jargon as possible. So whilst we'll have people from different backgrounds and different sectors assessing the applications, don't assume that someone knows the intricate details of your topic and start using lots of jargon and acronyms. Use plain English, be clear, be succinct to give yourself the best chance. So remember, it's competitive, but Churchill Fellowships are prestigious. They open doors overseas, they're well funded, and they're highly contested. It's not a reason to be shy. It's a reason to put forward your best foot and to put effort into your application. You will be competing against everyone else who lodges an application, and I've got no doubt most of those applications will satisfy the criteria generally. But it's how well you satisfy that criteria that will ultimately decide if you're successful. So make your application stand out, make it compelling, passion is usually something that can come through even in the written application, let alone the interview. So we've got a small team in Canberra, always available to provide answers to your questions in a timely manner. So on the slide there, you'll see our office number, our website address. And, you know, we do like to say no question's a silly question. And usually that's true. So on that note, I'm going to hand over now to our first speaker, Katrina Marson. Katrina is a 2018 Churchill Fellow, and she's currently the second in charge of the Sexual Offences Unit at the ACT Department of Public Prosecutions in Canberra, and has been interested in the power of relationships and sexuality education to protect against sexual violence since she did her honours thesis back in 2012. So certainly Katrina is someone very committed to respectful relationships and sexuality education, but I'll let her talk all about that. So over to you, Katrina.
Thanks, Adam. All right, so thank you so much for attending today's event, everyone. It's wonderful to be able to be talking to people again about Churchill Fellowships and prospective applications, and particularly to hear, as we just did, that people are starting to get to go overseas again. That's really, really exciting. So what I would like to do is start by explaining what my Churchill Fellowship was and where I went. I went overseas to investigate the implementation of relationships and sexuality education overseas. First I went to Ireland, then I went to the UK, I went to Germany and the Netherlands and to Canada, and then I ended up in America, which was not so much, when I was in America, I wasn't actually looking at relationships and sexuality education there. I was actually attending a conference, and I know Adam's just said that it's not for that purpose. It just so happened that I was in North America at the time of this US National Sexual Health Conference. And I'll come back to that because I ended up actually presenting what I had researched so far at that conference. So I'll come back to that. So they are the countries that I went to. I was looking at the implementation of relationships and sexuality education because in Australia we have some really great research about what I call RSE, the acronym RSE, relationships and sexuality education. We have some great research about what RSE can achieve in terms of changing attitudes and behaviour and acting as a protective factor against sexual violence. And we have some great research around what it needs to include, what it needs to look like. I wanted to go and see the practical perspective of that. I wanted to see how it actually operated in practice in other comparable communities and countries that had similar sort of education systems. And I also wanted to understand the question of implementation, because in Australia, that is where we have always stalled at the implementation stage, crossing over from a great idea in research and theory into classrooms, translating into changed attitudes and beliefs, driving those rates of sexual violence down. And so I wanted to understand what these countries and communities did to actually get it to take off in earnest and to overcome things like opposition from people who were concerned that sex ed would sexualize their young people, and to overcome things like concern for teachers about whether they can deliver it effectively, concern from parents. So that's what I investigated. Excuse me. I've been talking a lot today, so my throat is quite dry. So that's a general overview of my project. In terms of some highlights to give you, I said I'd return to the question of the conference that I spoke about in the United States. To me, that was a highlight because very quickly, very soon after I'd done most of this research, I was able to actually start talking about it to people and presenting it to interested parties. And I was surprised by the level of interest from people at that conference already. And for me, it was like I just finished my research. I hadn't even pulled together my findings, and yet people were already interested. What do these countries do in terms of implementing sex ed, and how can we learn from them in implementing that here? And obviously in that case, it was in the US. And since I've been back, I've seen a similar sort of interest from people about how we can learn from those countries I visited here in Australia. One of the other highlights is a really general one, in the sense of the experience of meeting people who really care about the subject that you care about and who you can learn from. You just spend the whole time in this state of thrill and excitement, and you just think, I wish this was my day job, that I could just go around talking to people about this thing that I love every day and seeing how they do it really well. So that was one of my favorite parts of it. Like I said, I just spent the time in this sort of days of joy and excitement about what we could possibly learn from them and bring back to Australia. But I have to say, the best thing about my Churchill Fellowship was the young people that I got to see in classrooms, learning about relationships and sexuality education. And I did try and pull some slides together with some photos, but I'm just technologically not particularly gifted. So unfortunately, I won't be able to show you those photos, but you can see them in my Churchill Fellowship report if you're interested. But, you know, young people as young as 3 or 4 years old, learning about the parts of their body that nobody can look at or touch if they don't want them to. So the mouth, the chest, genitals and bottoms, and saying it without shame, without embarrassment, being able to talk about these things quite comfortably in a safe and respectful way. And as I said, they were 3 or 4 years old. And, you know, being able to use words like penis and vagina without any discomfort, although more often it was peanuts and vagina, which was also very cute. And then there were, you know, kids a little bit older than that, and I saw teachers asking them, how old do you think people are when they start having sex? So this is when you're at the age group where it's appropriate to actually introduce the topic of sexual intercourse, which is obviously a fair bit older than 3 or 4 years old. But once you get to that age appropriate level, the teachers are talking about what sexual intercourse is, what reproduction is, and asking kids, how old do you think people are when they start having sex? And obviously one of the concerns around sex ed is that it will encourage young people to engage in sexual behavior or feel emboldened to engage in sexual behavior. And in fact, that's not what happens at all. And there was this very cute example that I think really emphasizes that. There was one little boy who put up his hand and he said, it might be good to do it before you retire, which was just adorable. And that was really common. That was the experience that I saw, that young people don't feel encouraged to engage in sexual behavior by learning about what it is. In fact, it helps them to know the things that they need to know to protect themselves and each other as they get older. So that was my favorite bit, was the young people and their enthusiasm and their curiosity about this topic, and, you know, the significant levels of confidence around their own rights, their own bodies and that kind of thing. And it was just really inspiring and something that that we can certainly learn from. All right, so they're sort of some of the highlights that I would identify, and I'm sure that if you're successful, they're the kinds of joys that you would get to experience on whatever subject matter it is that you choose. In terms of what I've learned about not just my subject matter, but the Churchill Fellowship generally, because I think this applies across the board, is that people really want to know what is happening overseas. So I mentioned that, I alluded to that when I was talking about the United States conference, the conference I was at in Chicago. They were really interested in the European experience and what had happened in Canada and what I had learnt only weeks prior. And then that's just been magnified tenfold since I've been back, in the years since I've been back. People are really interested in what do they do abroad? What can we learn from that? And I guess the willingness that the Australian community has to not assume that we know best or that we can't learn anything from communities overseas. I think that was really, I found that a very rewarding result of my Churchill Fellowship, is that enthusiasm. Some of the things that I have been able to do with that receptivity in the Australian community, and obviously my subject matter has become something of relevance in the last 18 months or so, with the sort of increased community attention around sexual violence and the need to prevent sexual violence, and including education as part of that prevention story. So it has become much more centered in the community attention, but there was already that receptivity there, as I say. Relevant stakeholders, decision makers who have significant power in this space were very interested in what I was able to communicate from what I'd learned overseas. So one of the things that I've done since then is establish the Relationships and Sexuality Education Alliance in the ACT, and that was directly mimicking something that I saw in the UK. In the UK, they have something called the Sex Education Forum, and it's a collective of relevant stakeholders and experts in the area of sex ed who have been working in this space for decades, but it's also teachers' unions, it's faith-based school representatives, it's parents' councils. They bring together all of the stakeholders in sex ed to, I guess, lend a collective voice to advocate for universal access to relationships and sexuality education, to get into some of the issues that arise, to assist by providing research, pointing in the direction of resources. And because of the Sex Education Forum, in 2019, so just before I got there, they were preparing to introduce legislation that mandated relationships and sexuality education for young Britons. So that was but the Sex Education Forum had significantly contributed to that effort to see that outcome. So when I returned, what I guess I learned from that was that sex ed is a space that has a multitude of stakeholders that have different and equally important voices, and that it's important to bring those voices together rather than working in all these kind of silos and then it potentially becoming an area for sort of division or disunity in something that we're all aiming for, which is universal access to relationships and sexuality education. So that's what I learned from that experience in the UK. And I tried to mimic that here in the ACT with the Alliance, and we launched late last year, and we're already having great engagement through some projects that the ACT government is doing in the space of sexual violence prevention. I was also lucky enough to be able to contribute to the recent curriculum revisions that you may have heard about in the news recently, consent being increased in terms of curriculum content at the national curriculum level. Now, while that's definitely not all that relationships and sexuality education is about, and that's a big part of my research and what I learned overseas, is that we can't just focus on the topic of consent. It is an important part of it, and putting it in the curriculum and being able to be involved in that process was a real privilege, and something that was only possible because of my Churchill Fellowship. This is the real benefit of a Churchill Fellowship, is that it gives you a credibility in your research. It gives you something to point to in terms of, because you have to come back and pull together that report. You have findings that you can point someone to. And if you write it in a way that is digestible, and some people, as I did, get graphic designers to help them at the last stage of the report to actually make it all look really engaging and beautiful. It's something that you can easily point to or hand over to people. And as I say, it just gives you a level of credibility. It's not just the prestige, it's credibility and a voice that people are willing to trust on this topic. And you have that unique experience that everyone's interested in. As I was saying, they're really interested in what they do overseas, and that's quite unique compared to other people who might be working in the same space in Australia. So that, for me, is really the benefit of the Churchill Fellowship. But my favorite thing about the Churchill Fellowship is in the name, which is that it is a fellowship. It feels like such a community of friends and respected colleagues, and a fellowship, a group of people you can always rely on. The team at Churchill House are always willing to put you in touch with other fellows who might be have something to engage with you on, who might be able to help you in any particular direction, particularly if we're talking about that impact side of things that Adam was mentioning before. Those connections, when you get back between and across the fellowship, from people who went many years ago to people who've just recently gone, those connections, that network is equally as valuable, and it feels very warm and very collaborative across the fellowship. So that's my very favorite thing about the fellowship is that friendship and those networks and that connection that you have all across Australia. And once you learn about the Churchill Fellowship, you find out that everybody is a Churchill Fellow, not quite, but they're everywhere. You'll meet them in all walks of life. So now that you know about it, you'll see them everywhere, and hopefully that will spur you on in feeling inspired to do your applications, as it did for me. And I wish you all the very best of luck with your applications. The one thing I'll say, the one piece of advice I'll give you in terms of your application, because Adam's already touched on letting your passion shine through. The other thing is learn about Winston Churchill, understand who he was and his philosophy, because it speaks to the philosophy and the meaning of the trust and what it intends to do. So that's my one piece of advice for your application. Sorry,
Great
Adam,
advice.
I hope I haven't gone over time.
That was great advice. Thanks, Katrina. I'm sure everyone found that highly useful. So next, I'll now introduce Julie Dunbaben. Julie is from Tasmania, and she received her fellowship also in 2018. Julie is a teacher and executive officer of the Tasmanian School Canteen Association, and Julie's fellowship purpose was to investigate factors that enable school lunch programs to impact positively on student health and well-being. And I think it'd be hard-pressed to find someone as passionate about healthy food for student well-being as Julie, and I'll let her talk about that. Thank you, Julie.
Just if I can. I'm just getting to my PowerPoint. I don't know where it's gone. Oh, there.
It'll turn up. It's okay.
All right. Okay. I'm probably hitting too many. Is it turned up yet?
Haven't seen it, but if in doubt, feel free to just progress without the slides.
There we go.
Oh, here it comes. It's there now.
Yep. Is that showing the slide? Okay,
If you just go to resume the slideshow at the top there, and it should start it.
Not sure why that's not coming.
Or choose slideshow at the top on the menu, and then start slideshow to the right of it.
Said from beginning. Sorry, just bear with me. I'm not sure why it's not coming up.
You can just click through on the left if you prefer.
Yeah.
I can share the slide.
So, hello everyone, and thank you for this opportunity. It's a wonderful opportunity, and also it's a wonderful opportunity for you to see what you can do when you have a passion that you have. My passion was obviously around the way that we feed children in Australia and how that compared to how children were fed elsewhere. I was very lucky to receive the inaugural Elvie Munday Churchill Fellowship. And Elvie was a staff member of the Churchill Trust, and she also had a passion for school canteens. Unfortunately, she's not with us anymore, but I feel very honoured that I received that particular fellowship. So most of you know about school canteens. They're usually very traditional fare, very much about pies and sausage rolls and chicken nuggets. And whilst we have programs in place, we meet and we do address Australian dietary guidelines, we know we've got too many children eating not a balanced array of foods during the day, and particularly not at school. So I actually was able to go to, let me see if I can, to 7 countries, and I was away for actually 10 weeks. 8 weeks of that was related to my fellowship, and I was able to fit in 2 weeks where my family met me in Japan. This is where the fellowship has some flexibility. Obviously, they don't pay for your family to meet you, but we were able to meet up to celebrate my 60th birthday whilst I was in Japan. And Japan was my last stop. So I started off in the USA, in Chicago and Washington, DC. I did have ulterior motives to try and meet up with Michelle Obama, but I didn't quite, but I did meet her Secretary of State in relation to food and nutrition when the Obama administration was in power. She had become very protected by the time I arrived there. So, but still I learned a lot from visiting key people in Chicago and Washington, DC about the school lunches that they provided. Also travelled, as you can see, to England, Scotland, Finland, Italy, France and Japan. And I was supposed to be going to Holland, but I did get sick in France, and this can happen. It can be quite challenging if that does happen. I did have to go to hospital, and in France, in Paris, so it was a bit challenging. I have to say, even though that happened, my whole trip was absolutely amazing, and I am so grateful that I've been able to do a Churchill. I got my fellowship in 2018, but I didn't travel till later the next year, between October and December 2019, just before the world went a little bit pear-shaped, but I did get home in time. The three major highlights for me was you'll be blown away with the amazing work that is happening around the world, and I obviously was in the school food space, so there was so much happening, so much for me to learn. Like what Katrina said, people are also interested in what you're up to and what you're doing in your backyard. So I was, one of the highlights for me, and there were actually many, and you could look at my report, but I did get to speak at Westminster All-Party School Lunch Committee in London, which was just an honour to go into that amazing building and actually speak to politicians, etc., about what we were doing and what we were looking at trying to do. The other thing is the generosity of people, and as has already alluded to, the ongoing friendships and support that you'll establish during your journey, and they will continue because of that amazing connection that you'll create with them. And then obviously there are resources, ideas, connections, and that confirmation of what you want to do and why you want to do it. That living the dream, for me anyway, is for all children to be fed well whilst they're at school. You'll get lots and lots of resources given to you. I had to post home a lot of things along the way because my bag was getting heavier and heavier. Often you can say, please send that to me, or can you send that to me electronically? But there's also that element of people wanting to give you things. So I must say that before I left, I, like Katrina, when we got back, I actually used a graphic artist to design some little buttons for me that I was able to hand out to what I thought to children, but actually the adults were more keen on the little buttons than the children were. So, you know, it's about those lovely connections that you can create. Some of the unexpected or surprising elements were that the countries that I visited, they all had a school lunch program that since the end of World War II, and in all cases it was because of trying to get children connected back to school, but also the malnourishment of children at that point in time. So school lunches became food for everyone. It wasn't just for children that have difficulty accessing food. And this is one of the barriers that I'm working with at the moment, that it needs to be equitable. It needs to be for everyone. Food shouldn't define who you are whilst you're at school. But what I found was that there wasn't a lot of evaluation. So evaluation hadn't been woven in along the way. And that was one of many of their countries' regrets about not evaluating. So since coming back, I've really worked hard to tie in evaluation with anything that we've done, try and shift from our traditional canteen to what I hope will be feeding every child a meal, a sit-down meal. Other unexpected thing was you have to become very adept at how how to PowerPoints in every different country. So you need to be really well prepared for that. There's a whole range of PowerPoint situations that I can tell you about. And also how showers turn on and off, and blending those. It's quite an intricate process in some of the hotels, etc., that I stayed in. So there was some formal and a funny side of some of my unexpected and surprising experiences. These are just some pictures of the school lunches that I saw. They don't look like what we serve up to children in Australia. In fact, we're probably more along the lines of the USA. You can see the breaded chicken nuggets there. I must say though, this picture of myself, that was the very first school that I visited, and it was some amazing food. It wasn't anything like the actual picture of the USA, more generic school lunch meal. So it was great to see how a system worked, but also how some individual schools addressed the issue of feeding children well. So what's happened since bringing my knowledge home? Obviously, as Katrina said, you'll need to write a report, and as daunting as that might seem, it's actually not, because it doesn't have to be academic. It can be pictorial. I had lots of photos to share in my report about what the children were eating. And from that report, I've then been able to present some key findings about the success factors that make healthy school lunches actually impact on children's health and well-being, and also their learning outcomes. And we were fortunate enough in 2020 to get a little bit of money to trial a school lunch pilot, only for 20 days in 3 schools in Tasmania. And we linked that in with the Menzies Institute for Medical Research. So they actually evaluated that pilot. And then we had a state election last year. And interestingly enough, because of the success of my Churchill recommendations and then the pilot, both major parties used a school lunch program as part of their platform, their election platform. Different amounts of money, and unfortunately, and in some ways fortunately, we've got the lesser amount, but it's enabled us this year to work with 15 selected schools through an expression of interest process, which involves our education department, our health department, and our Communities Tasmania department, to actually identify 15 schools. And we're in a very short time frame, we had actually 29 schools wanting to be part of this pilot. So our next stage, which is this year and next year's, we're starting with 15 schools this year, and then we will grow to 30 schools next year. And we will be doing the same as the little pilot, that instead of measuring, or as well as measuring things like attendance and behaviour, because of children eating more wholesome food, because this food is cooked from scratch, and it's also served at tables where children sit down and eat. So they're actually allocated more than the 5 minutes of the traditional school lunchtime allocation. So they actually enjoyed the fact that they could sit down and eat with their colleagues or their classmates, not colleagues. And we had lots of children eating food that would not eat that food if it was put in their lunchbox or eat it at home. We got a lot of feedback from parents saying, what are you doing? How are you getting my child to eat? And it is mainly because of that peer group situation that I saw in action in the countries that I visited. So we're in the throes of getting that started. There's issues around infrastructure and skill sets, which we don't have in our country, which was very evident in the countries that I visited. So that again has given me leverage to say, well, we need these elements for this to work. And we in Tasmania, we only have approximately 280 schools in the whole state, government and non-government. I know it would be a totally different kettle of fish in, say, New South Wales or Queensland, Victoria. So it's great that Tassie can actually sort of trial this method of feeding children well. Here's some lovely shots of the children from one of the schools in the Little Pilot, just really enjoying eating food from scratch. Some of them connected their salads, for example, to their school garden. Some of them had never eaten some of the meals that we'd prepared for them to taste, and they gave us feedback on that food. Some of the children had very poor access to food. One little boy couldn't believe that he could have a whole plate of food and then actually go back for more. He was from a big family of 9 siblings. We had children going to school for the first time in 2020 because, I mean, COVID obviously had some impact as well, but it was purely for the lunch. He started off coming before lunch and then being picked up again after lunch. And by the time the 20 days, the 4 weeks had happened, the child was there. This is one example, was there at the start of the school day and he stayed the whole day. So the same principles as to why some of the countries started their school lunch programs are actually beneficial for what could happen here in Australia. The best thing about being a fellow, Katrina's already mentioned a few things, but I think I would quite honestly say that none of what I've just shared with you would not have happened without my Churchill. I have talked about this for a long, long time, but to have my fellowship behind me has been absolutely crucial and instrumental in what's happened since coming back. My Churchill's opened many doors and given merit to my dream of all children being fed well whilst they're at school. And we're starting to see that happen here in Tasmania, which is just fantastic. That's what I'd like to share with you, but I really do encourage you to show your passion through your application. I did have quite a unique way of my application, so I wasn't actually able to do it at the committee meeting, but that's since changed anyway with COVID. But your passion, I think, the passion of it is really crucial. And there's so much fun to be had and so much learning and so much joy at the other end. So I do very much value my Churchill, and I'm sure you will as well. And good luck with your applications.
Fantastic. Thank you, Julie, for your time and for sharing that amazing fellowship and your work. So we do have now several questions, and I'll go through them, and Katrina and Julie, I'll defer to you where necessary. The first question was about the application form and the ability to add previous employers. You can select up to 3. The question is, do you put the best 3 past employers, i.e. the ones that are best at supporting the application? Look, I think so. I wouldn't go back too far in time. Obviously, they need to be, reasonably recent. But I think obviously relevant employers would be the best. What dates can we travel for the fellowship? So you can depart from 1 February 2023, and we typically give people 12 months during which time they need to depart. So I guess technically the latest you could depart will be 31 January 2024 to actually commence your fellowship travel. From time to time, we will consider extensions. Sometimes things out of people's control happen and they just can't get away in that year. But, I guess we're talking about 1 to 2 years from now, so plenty of time to get organised. We do have a dependence allowance. You don't have to tick that box unless you think you need the support. So that is particularly a mechanism designed to support people where their household income will reduce by the amount specified in that allowance. It's not something you need to select though, but if you think it applies to you, you can select that. Will there be interview hubs in all major cities, or do you have to travel to Canberra? So each capital city is where the interviews are held. If you've got a significant distance to travel, then I think video interviews are an option. We can consider some support with accommodation or flights if it's particularly important for you to get there for a face-to-face interview and you've got a long way to go. That's usually an issue for people in Northern Territory because of the distances there to Darwin. A question for Katrina. Did involving schools in your research need ethics approval from education departments in those countries you visited?
No, I didn't have to get ethics approval. What I did do though was and that's partly because I actually didn't spend too much time within schools. Because I was looking at the implementation of sex ed, I wanted to speak to kind of policymakers, politicians, the people who design the sex ed, the education department officials themselves, teachers, parent groups. I did go to a few schools, as I mentioned, and they were in England predominantly. So what I did was I got a Working with Vulnerable People's card, which is the ACT equivalent of whatever they have in the UK that you have to be able to go into schools. And because I was connected with private providers who were going into schools, they sort of gave the schools the heads up that I was coming and made sure that they were aware I had that Working with Vulnerable People's card. That seemed to suffice. But do check before you go what the requirements are if you want to go into schools, definitely.
And just for anyone with similar questions, it's usually academic researchers who ask these questions. The Trust doesn't require ethics approvals for anything. It's not the type of research projects that we manage, but that's up to you to work out for yourself if you think you need to do that. The next question, Katrina, also for you, thanks for sharing, says the questioner, can you please explain your process in identifying and making contact with the people and organisations you visited when you planned your itinerary? So how did you go about that?
Yeah, sure. There was sort of basic Googling to start with in terms of what is going on in different parts of the world in terms of sex ed. And then what I did was I found this really great example in the Netherlands that's quite prestigious. It's used in other parts of the world as well. It's very famous and well known. I really wanted to speak to the designers and the institute that's behind that project, which is the Spring Fever program in primary schools and Live, Laugh, Love in high schools, and they're called Rutgers Institute. So I started there, and then once you find sort of one place, you'll start to find others that are they have a relationship, or they mention each other in articles, those kinds of things. And then you can kind of go from there. Once you start making contact with individuals behind those places, they might have recommendations of who else you should speak to. So for me, it was a lot of word of mouth. The other thing is leave some time in your itinerary, because when you get there, they'll say, oh, you should speak to so-and-so at the University of blah, blah, while you're in Toronto. And then you can email them and say, do you have any time this week or whatever? And if they do, you can meet with them because you haven't overbooked your schedule. So it's a bit of an iterative, organic process as well.
That's a good answer. I can see Julie nodding there. We've got a couple of questions about the itinerary. So, do you add specific dates? For your application, no, you don't need to add specific dates. You might indicate you're thinking, July or whatever the sort of time period is, based on your topic might be seasonal, and some applicants have that. But for your application, we just really need a duration, so half a week, week and a half, how long you think you're going to be there. If you're then awarded your fellowship, you'll then have time to nut out the timing and when you're going to do it, and we'll approve a final itinerary before you start booking your travel. And I think you don't need to contact the people, organisations, and say to us at the interview or in your application, I've contacted all these people and got it all lined up, because that can be a bit difficult if you haven't got a fellowship. So like I might be getting a fellowship, I want to start locking in dates. As Katrina said, you can make contact, you can reach out to them. You don't need letters of support from the institutions. We don't require that. But I think, it's not a bad idea to be able to say, look, I know that this institution will accept visitors for this type of thing. You could say, look, I have reached out just initially, and I know that they'd be happy to receive me as a Churchill Fellow, but you don't need to have done that. So I think that's a bit much to ask people to start locking things in. Someone has asked, how specific should the project we're investigating be? Is it better to really hone in on one issue or keep it broader? I would say, laser-like focus on what you want to achieve is going to give you the strongest, most compelling application. So we'll have lots of applicants that are like, you know, passionate, really clear and strong and champing at the bit to go and find out more about this specific thing. If you're kind of like, yeah, it might be a bit of this, bit of that, not sure, you know, that's going to not be as a compelling application. To be sure, there'll be some things where you say, I don't know what I don't know until I get there, and that's fine, but you need to be really clear on what it is that you're looking to learn. And look, in some cases, people do their fellowship and they come back and say, look, I learned about this, but wow, I also discovered this tangential sideline thing that's related that I didn't even know I'd learn about. And as Katrina said, you know, make sure in your itinerary you leave enough time for those serendipitous kind of meetings that pop up that you can't you know, really plan for at all. So I think someone else asked, how do you find examples of where things are working well and what you'd like to study? And I think Katrina probably did cover that off. You know, you can do online research, you can use your own existing networks, those sorts of things to find out. I guess, you know, if you at this point in time, if you don't know, if you have no idea if anyone overseas is doing these things better, maybe it's a bit late to apply this year, or you could get your skates on. You've got till the end of April, but I think you probably have a good sense now if things are happening overseas that you could learn more from. There's a question, another one's come in. If you have a disability, can the trust assist with funding for a support person? Yes, absolutely, we have and will continue to do so. And costs of traveling with a guide dog, absolutely, if that's something that's going to help you, yes, absolutely, we can consider that and would support that. How should that be documented for us to calculate? I think just, you know, let us know. You could potentially mention it in your application, but I don't think that's really going to be essential. We would then, if you're awarded the fellowship, we would talk to you anyway and be in touch and work that out. So I wouldn't get too worried about that. We definitely would support that. So I think I might have covered off all the questions. If there's no more questions, then I'm going to say thank you to everyone who stayed on, which is most of the participants. If you do have follow-up questions, you can contact the trust. You've got those details. You can attend a future session. Thanks again, Julie and Katrina, for your insights and sharing your stories. I'm sure everyone really enjoyed it. And if you're applying, good luck and thank you.